Researchers have discovered chimpanzees can revise their beliefs when presented with new evidence. To test this, they hid food inside one of two boxes and presented them to the chimpanzees. They would then provide either a strong or weak piece of evidence about one of the boxes to suggest whether it contained food, such as shaking it to make a sound, or directly showing them what was inside. The chimpanzee could then make an initial choice of where they thought the food was hidden. The researcher then provided a new piece of evidence about the other box that was either stronger or weaker than the initial evidence. Would they stick with their first choice or change their mind?
Jan Engelmann, thanks so much for coming on to Evolution Soup all the way from your home in Oakland, California, USA. You are Associate Professor of Psychology at University of California, Berkeley, focusing on animal cognition and comparative psychology. Along with an international team of researchers, you've released the results of fascinating island-based experiments observing that chimpanzees can change their minds based on evidence, a key feature of rational thought. Welcome to the show, Jan. Well, the results of the study have only just been revealed. It must be gratifying for you and the team to finally be able to show the world what you've discovered.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Mark. I'm really excited to talk to you about our study. So yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, this kind of study takes about 5-6 years to really complete. It involves 8 sub-studies. So yeah, it was a lot of work by, I would say 12 or even 15 different people. So yeah, after such a long time, we're really excited to have it out there and see what people think.
Before we explore the world of cognition and this incredible experiment, let's just hear a little bit about your background. Jan, can you take us down the academic road that led you to where you are now?
Yeah, sure. So during my undergrad, I was actually always really excited about both biology and philosophy. And I was always trying to find ways to combine the two. And then I actually, by serendipity, found a great way, which is studying the cognition of animals. And this happened through a route to Argentina. So I studied in Buenos Aires for a year, and I had to do some sort of, field-based internship for my biology studies. And then my professor there sent me to Estación Biológica Corrientes, which is a primatology field site in the northern part of Argentina, where a number of researchers study howler monkeys. And I was added to a project that investigated the social behavior of howler monkeys. And yeah, I've never stopped since, kind of. So from there, I went to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany, which is an interdisciplinary institute dedicated to studying humans in relation to other animals. And yeah, I've just been very fortunate to find this little niche, which really is an amazing combination of biology and philosophy, because we basically use biological methods and biological theory to address very old philosophical questions, such as what makes humans unique, what makes humans different from other animals, questions that already, people like Aristotle asked.
So I'm a comparative psychologist. And as comparative psychologists, we have the sort of great task of finding out what differentiates human psychologies from the psychologies of other animals. So there literally are people who run experiments to figure out, how do giraffes think? What do giraffes feel? And how are giraffes' thoughts and giraffes' feelings different from the kind of feelings that we as humans have, and in which ways are they similar? And actually, it was kind of introduced as a very new topic, comparative psychology, but I would argue that this tendency to compare humans to other animals has very, very deep historic roots.
Your research interests lie in comparative psychology. Can you explain what is meant by comparative psychology as it pertains to the study of human and animal cognition?
Yeah, sure. So, if we start off with this question, what kind of an animal is a human? A sort of obvious method to answer this question is to compare humans to other animals. And that's actually a method that has very deep roots. So I already mentioned Aristotle, but even the ancient Greek thinkers like Aristotle and Plato, when they were trying to define what a human is, they were already comparing humans to other animals. They were at a sort of disadvantage, though, because when they lived in ancient Greek, there were no non-human primates around. So when they compared humans to other animals, they would compare humans to, domesticated animals like sheep or cows. So the gap between humans and other animals really seemed massive. So this has luckily changed in the meantime. And now when we do comparative psychology, we can compare humans to a number of different animals. In my research, or in the research of my research team, we often compare humans to one of our closest living relatives, to chimpanzees, because we think that really allows us to zoom in on the subtle differences that we see between humans and other animals.
Between 2021 and 2025, you and your colleagues conducted a series of experiments at the Ngamba Island Chimpanzee Sanctuary in Uganda that tested chimpanzees' ability to reflect on their own thinking and evidence sources. Jan, how did this experiment come about, and what sort of tests did these chimps undergo?
Yeah, so I think for the last 10 years or so, we have really been interested in this question of the evolution of rationality. So why look at rationality? Well, rationality has traditionally and historically been seen as one of these key markers of human uniqueness. So humans are often described as the rational animal, for example. So that's why we really wanted to focus on rationality. And you might also wonder, well, why study the evolution of rationality? What's so interesting about the evolution of that capacity? Well, we're really trying to do a form of evolutionary psychology here. So we're trying to explain how psychological capacities have evolved over evolutionary time. So much in the same way that, for example, evolutionary biologists are really interested in how, the human eye has evolved from a very simple light-sensitive eye patch all the way to the complex lens eye that we have today. Through a series of gradual intermediate steps, we are interested in studying how human psychological capacities have likewise evolved in this gradual way over evolutionary time. By the way, already Darwin was one of the first people to suggest the possibility of evolutionary psychology. So in his 1859, in his famous book, Origin of Species, in the conclusion to that book, he says something like, in the distant future, psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each power and capacity by gradation. So Darwin already 170 years ago or so had this vision of psychology being an evolutionary science, that we can, tell or form evolutionary hypotheses about how specific psychological capacities have evolved. And that's specifically what we did here for the capacity of rationality. And so what is rationality? What does this term really refer to here? So in this context, rationality refers to epistemic rationality, which is the tendency to form beliefs in light of evidence. So to be rational is to respond appropriately to evidence. And we want to specifically look at whether chimpanzees, one of our closest living relatives, have this capacity to respond appropriately to evidence. And I would say that there's sort of two signatures of responding appropriately to evidence that are particularly important and that have received a lot of attention in the literature. The first one is belief revision. So belief revision is of interest to people, and it's often seen as a particularly strong indicator of rationality, because to revise your beliefs rationally, you sometimes have to give up cherished beliefs that you have held for a long time. So we often irrationally hold on to beliefs, even in light of strong counter evidence, because it can be very hard to give up beliefs. So this is the first signature of rational thought that we looked at in chimpanzees. And then the second signature of rational thought that we looked at is reflecting on evidence. So here the question was whether chimpanzees actually represent the evidence they have and can thereby reflect on whether the evidence that they have really is good support for the hypothesis or the belief that they have formed. So this is often described as representing the evidential relation, where the evidential relation is a three-part relation between evidence, hypothesis, and their causal connection. And so our second main interest, beside belief revision here, was understanding whether chimpanzees represent this evidential relation and thereby reflect on their evidence.
So, Jan, what was the actual setting for these experiments, and what experiments did you do first?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the setting is, as you mentioned, Ngamba Island Chimpanzee Sanctuary, which is an amazing sanctuary that's located on an island in the middle of Lake Victoria in Uganda. And on that island, you have about 52 chimpanzees and about 12 humans who live there in separate areas of the island, though. And yeah, the majority of the island, about 95% of the island, is a wild forest where chimpanzees can roam freely throughout the day, and they forage in that forest, and they live very much like they would live in the wild there. Overnight, chimpanzees come into these sleeping rooms where they spend their nights, and it's in these sleeping rooms that we can actually set up our studies, our experiments. And, you know, participation in our experiments is completely voluntary. So chimpanzees participate only if they feel like it on a given day. If they don't want to participate, they can always go out to the forest. So we usually, you know, set up our experimental apparatus. And usually what happens is that chimpanzees, if they, you know, participate and if they do well in our experiments, they can get a little reward, like they may get a little piece of apple or a little piece of banana. And luckily for us, chimpanzees really enjoy these experiments. So because it's a form of enrichment also for them. And they also really enjoy getting food. They're very food motivated. So yeah, we are mostly pretty lucky in managing to recruit quite a good number of chimpanzees who voluntarily participate. For this specific study, the setup was very simple, and it looked as follows. We had two boxes, two opaque boxes, and the chimpanzees knew that food was hidden in one of the two boxes. So food was either always in box A or in box B. And now we gave chimpanzees evidence to determine the location of the food. This was the first step of the experiment. For example, evidence could be something like auditory evidence. So we would shake one of the boxes and the chimpanzees would hear something, and then based on that, they could infer that food should be hidden in the box. By the way, chimpanzees can also do the reverse. So we sometimes would shake the box that didn't contain food, then chimpanzees wouldn't get auditory feedback, and from this they would infer that the food must be in the other box. So this was the sort of basic setup of our experiment. I talked before about belief revision and how that was our main interest in this study. And to really tap into chimpanzees' belief revision, we devised the following 4-step procedure. So the first step was that we gave chimpanzees evidence for box A. Then we let chimpanzees make a choice. That was the second step. So here they would mostly choose box A. But instead of revealing the contents of box A to chimpanzees, we pulled, the two boxes back and gave chimpanzees counter evidence. That was step 3. So we would now give them evidence for the other box, for the box that they hadn't chosen. And then in a fourth step, we let them make a choice again. So this was, and then of course the main question was, would chimpanzees revise their initial belief, or would chimpanzees maintain and confirm their initial belief? That was the basic setup.
So Jan, were there any other experiments that you performed on this island?
Yeah, absolutely. So you might remember that I mentioned before that we were particularly interested in these two signatures of rationality or rational thought: belief revision and reflecting on evidence. So we also conducted another set of experiments where we really wanted to get at this question of whether chimpanzees actually, when they respond to evidence, whether they represent and reflect on that evidence. And to get at this question, we actually used some concepts from analytic philosophy, more precisely from epistemology, and we used the concept of an undermining defeater. So an undermining defeater is basically a type of second-order evidence. What that means is that it's not first-order evidence, it's not evidence that directly speaks to a hypothesis, for example, evidence that supports a hypothesis, but it's a piece of evidence that speaks to the first piece of evidence. So for example, it's a new piece of evidence that might show you that the first-order piece of evidence that you have acquired is actually not a very strong piece of evidence. So just to give you an example, let's say, Mark, I ask you for the best Italian restaurant in London, and then you tell me the name of a restaurant. Now I've a piece of evidence, right? You have told me the best restaurant in London, but now I might hear from someone else that Mark really doesn't know a lot about Italian restaurants. Now, this is a second order piece of evidence. This is an undermining defeater because it shows that the first piece of evidence that I received is actually misleading or maybe not quite as strong as I had thought. So the challenge was, of course, you can tell that I now needed to use quite a lot of language to explain the concept of an undermining defeater. So the challenge was, of course, since all of our studies are nonverbal studies, how can we test chimpanzees' reaction to undermining defeaters in a nonverbal experimental paradigm? That was tough. I'll just give you one example. We came up with two different versions, but one example was, I already mentioned the auditory evidence before, right? So where we would shake one of the boxes, and then based on this auditory evidence, chimpanzees would infer that food is located in that box and pick that box. Now, to get at an undermining defeater, here's what we did. We first shook that box. Chimpanzees heard something, sure enough, they picked that box. However, what we did next is that we retrieved something from this box, something that's not food, that could have caused this sound. And when we did that, chimpanzees actually reacted in an amazing way. They revised their initial belief and now picked the other box. So in their mind, a thought process must have gone on that must look something like this in language now. Well, I thought there was food in there because I heard something in there, but now I was shown that what caused the sound probably was not food. So my initial evidence for my belief is not longer valid. So I'm going to revise my belief. Here you see now an example of what this experiment looked like. The chimp who's participating in this trial is Kidogo, who's a 40-year-old chimpanzee, a female chimpanzee living on Ngamba Island Chimpanzee Sanctuary. Now, I've worked with Kidogo for many, many years. She's one of my favorite chimps. What I really like about her is that she's such a calm chimp. So with her, you really have the feeling that she reflects before she makes decisions. with other chimps, when they participate in our studies, they're so excited because there's the possibility of them getting food. So sometimes I have the feeling that they don't think enough before they make a choice. Okay, so here's the setup. You see the two boxes that I've talked about before, and you see Kidogo in the sleeping room. So this is the strong evidence first condition. So here, the first piece of evidence for the box on the left that I'll show to Kidogo is the strong piece of evidence, and then which is auditory evidence here, which is the type of evidence I've spoken about before. And after that, I'll show Kidogo counter evidence for the other box, but that evidence is weaker. So this is, as you will see, these are trails of food leading to that box. Okay, so let me play the video. Okay, so this is the strong evidence. Kidogo makes a choice, she picks that box. Now I present counter evidence, the trails of food. Kidogo sees it, but she confirms her initial choice. And this is exactly what you would expect from a rational agent. When you have formed a belief, food is on this side, and then you're presented with counter evidence, but the counter evidence is weaker than the initial evidence, you should confirm your initial belief. Okay, so let's look at the other condition, which is the weak evidence first condition. So here, I will first show Kidogo the weak evidence, namely these food trails. And as you'll see, Kidogo uses that evidence. She picks the box associated with the food trails, but then I show Kidogo stronger evidence for the other box. And now the key question is, will Kidogo revise her belief and pick the other box?
Kidogo.
Okay, so here's the weak evidence first, the food trails. Kidogo picks the box.
Kidogo.
Now the counter evidence. And now Kidogo revises her belief and picks the other box.
So what were the conclusions at the end of these tests? What did you and your team find most exciting about your results?
Yeah, what was most exciting is that actually chimpanzees showed key signatures of rational thought. So before we started the study, we actually developed a mathematical model of what it would look like to respond rationally to the evidence in our experiments. And the very surprising and noteworthy thing is that the chimpanzee's behavior was actually in line with the mathematical model of what rational behavior in our experiment looks like. So just, to sort of relatively briefly summarize our key findings, the first key finding was that chimpanzees rationally respond to counter evidence. And what that means is that chimpanzees revised their initial belief when the counter evidence was stronger than the initial evidence. And chimpanzees maintained their initial belief when the counter evidence was weaker than their initial belief. And chimpanzees did this for a number of different types of evidences. So for example, we used one set of evidences in experiment 1 and a completely different set of evidences in experiment 2. So chimpanzees really judged evidence flexibly in context. And this flexibility in thought is one key marker of intelligence.
Further experiments showed even more sophistication from the chimpanzees. They were capable of changing their minds when previously strong evidence was defeated. As before, the researchers offered a clue about one of the boxes, but then revealed it to be misleading. For example, by pulling out a piece of paper to show that the food they had seen was merely a picture.
The second finding that I really want to highlight has to do with chimpanzees' responses to these undermining defeaters that I mentioned before. So here we found across two types of undermining defeaters that chimpanzees rationally took into consideration this second order evidence in their belief revision decisions. So chimpanzees were not only swayed by first order evidence that directly speaks to a hypothesis, but they were also influenced by evidence about the evidence. So they, for example, they understand something about when evidence might be misleading. And, maybe I'm going a little bit too far here, but to me, this is actually very similar to what we call critical thinking in humans. Because, of course, what critical thinking most fundamentally includes is reasoning about evidence and the extent to which that evidence supports a given hypothesis or belief. But this is very similar to what the chimpanzees did in our study in experiment 5. And so, I would say that to some extent, one might say that chimpanzees demonstrate a capacity for critical thinking in these experiments. And that's definitely what surprised us the most, I would say. Also because most theoretical accounts had argued that in order to think critically about evidence and the extent to which evidence supports a hypothesis, you need language. You need to represent that evidential relation in language. So one of the key questions that I'm really involved, that we are all really excited about, is to ask what kind of representational format that's not linguistic allows chimpanzees to reflect on evidence.
And what about the evolution of cognition? Unlike physical traits, cognition doesn't fossilize. So how is it researched and how are comparisons made?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question and one that I think about a lot. Evolutionary paleoanthropologists or so, who, for example, study the evolution of the human hand, they kind of have a slight advantage because bones fossilize, so they can actually find bones of our recent ancestors, like Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals. It would be very exciting for me, if we could study the cognition of Neanderthals. That's a little bit hard to do with just bones. But what's amazing is that we can compare the cognition of different living animals. And that's, of course, one way to get at the evolution of cognition. And I think the main goal really here, as I alluded to before, using also that great quote by Darwin, you remember Darwin said, in the distant future, psychology will be based on this new foundation, the acquirement of each psychological capacity by gradation. So the idea here really is to tell a gradual evolutionary story of how our cognitive and psychological abilities have evolved. So very often, I think, when we think about cognition and when we think about intelligence, we sort of approach the question with a binary attitude. So we sort of ask, well, chimpanzees are either rational or they're not rational. We sort of see many cognitive capacities more like an on and off switch. And what we're trying to do is we're really trying to develop these gradual phylogenetic hypothesis about how our cognition has evolved. So to adapt it to the current situation, our interest in rational thought, for example, we don't want to just say, well, chimpanzees or other animals are either rational or they're not rational. We actually want to break rationality into its component parts and then try to determine which of these components are present in other animals and which are present only in humans, so that we can then explain how rational thought has gradually evolved over evolutionary time. So, one hypothesis in the context of rationality, for example, where rationality is understood as responsiveness to evidence, one hypothesis is that maybe many non-human animal species respond unreflectively to evidence. So what that means is that their beliefs are sensitive to evidence, they're causally sensitive to evidence, but these animals cannot represent and reflect on this evidence. So this kind of reflective evidence responsiveness that I've also spoken about, that we have tapped into by using these undermining defeaters, is something that, for example, might have only evolved, in the great apes, because we have now shown that chimpanzees have something like reflective evidence responsiveness. And of course, humans also developed this ability at some point in the first few years of life. So that's sort of the general idea behind this research, that we're telling these gradual stories of how evolution has caused different cognitive mechanisms to evolve. Another key area that we're interested in at the moment is actually causal reasoning. So our thinking about how certain causes can have effects in the world. There's a very interesting hypothesis out there that from an evolutionary perspective, causal reasoning has gone through 3 stages, where the first stage is often called first personal causal reasoning. So this is where I reason about the fact that I can have effects in the world. So my causal reasoning at this stage is kind of restricted to myself. A next stage in the evolution of causal reasoning might then be what's called third personal causal reasoning. So at this stage, I don't only understand that I can have effects in the world, that I can be a cause in the world, but also that other people or other individuals can be a cause in the world. And the sort of third stage is often called impersonal causal reasoning. So that's now an understanding that also non-agentive entities can have effects in the world. So for example, wind can have certain effects in the world, or weight can have effects in the world. This sort of 3-step progression here is a theory that was developed by James Woodward and was recently further developed by Mariel Goudou and Alison Gopnik, and it's one that we're really interested in testing as well.
Jan, you show a lot of commonalities between chimpanzee rationality and human rationality. Do you think there is something unique about human rationality?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're totally right. Sort of our evidence or our findings suggest that what has historically been seen as the key differentiation line between humans and chimpanzees in terms of rationality, namely rational belief revision and reflecting on evidence, actually seems to be something that humans and chimpanzees have in common. So this is not something that differentiates humans from other animals. I will say, though, that probably there's still a form of rationality that is unique to humans and that we don't see in other animals. And that's something that I would call communicative rationality. So this is a concept that has been first developed by the philosopher Habermas. And what communicative rationality refers to is to our ability, it refers to the human tendency to actually reason rationally together. So we can engage in what's often called the social practice of giving and asking for reasons. So we can not only reflect about our evidence and the reasons we have in the privacy of our own minds, we can actually, thanks to our communicative abilities, express our reasons, share our reasons with others. Others can then comment on, endorse, or criticize our reasons. And through this iterative process, we can actually reason in more effective ways together than any one of us could have reasoned on their own individually. So this sort of perspective on communicative rationality fits very well with current theorizing about humans' extraordinary capacities of cultural evolution. So the idea is that much of what is special about the human mind is actually not a result of biological evolution, but rather of cultural evolution. So many of the cognitive capacities that we have, we might have actually not acquired biologically through inheritance, but rather socially by learning from others. And yeah, this idea that communicative rationality is what distinguishes our rationality from the rationality of other animals fits very nicely within this whole area of cultural evolution, which is receiving a lot of attention at this moment.
It's been really enlightening talking to you, Jan, and I'm very grateful that you've been able to take the time to share your findings with us on the show today. So, what's next for you? What upcoming projects can you tell us about?
Yeah, I would say sort of there are two lines of research that we have lined up for the future. The first line is replication. So we want to just get more data on rational thought in chimpanzees. We already have a lot of data from many different experiments in this study. But of course, you want to make sure as a scientist that your results are replicable, right? That they're actually robust. So at the moment, we're especially focusing in again on these undermining defeaters, on the second order kind of evidence that I've spoken about. And we want to see whether chimpanzees and actually also other non-human animals respond rationally to this kind of second order evidence also in other contexts. Now, the second line of research actually fits well with this idea of communicative rationality that I've spoken about, because we want to investigate to what extent chimpanzees also respond rationally to social counter-evidence. Now, you might have noticed when I described our experimental setup that the evidence that chimpanzees received was always what you could call physical evidence, right? So they either saw maybe crumbs of food or they heard the food. What people have argued is that what's special about humans is that we respond rationally not only to such physical pieces of evidence, but that we also respond rationally to social evidence. So one example of this is simply disagreement, right? So if I have picked one option and then you disagree with me and you pick another option, do I respond rationally to this? Do I, for example, take into consideration the evidence that you have for your choice in deciding whether to revise my initial belief or not? So that's something that we're very excited about testing with the chimps. So, the setup here is very similar to what we have just seen. Chimpanzees get a piece of evidence for one of the two boxes. They can pick one of the boxes, and then they see another chimp picking the other box. So this other chimp is basically disagreeing with them. And now we want to know whether chimpanzees rationally respond to the disagreement, which here means, are chimpanzees more likely to adopt the other chimp's belief when this other chimp had better evidence for their choice relative to their own evidence? And we've actually just finished the first round of data collection, and it really seems to be the case that chimpanzees also rationally respond to this social counter-evidence. They adopt the other chimp's belief only when this chimp actually had better evidence than they themselves did.
Wow. It's like peer pressure, isn't it?
It's not only peer pressure, because they actually don't adopt the other chimp's belief when the chimp has worse evidence than they have. So I would say it's rational peer pressure. So I've spoken about this communicative rationality and how humans are uniquely rational because they can reason together with others. But of course, I would say at the same time, this tendency to reason with others, yes, it makes humans uniquely rational, but it actually also makes us uniquely irrational relative to, for example, chimpanzees. As humans, we of course often succumb to peer pressure, and we, succumb to group pressure. We have what's often called group think. So we have this very strong tendency to hold the same beliefs, to arrive at the same conclusions as our group members, right? And as we know all too well, this often leads to very irrational beliefs that spread in social networks. And psychologists argue that this has to do with conformity to group pressure. And this is something that probably does not exist in chimpanzees. So I haven't heard anyone making the argument that there are group-based beliefs in chimpanzees and that you can only be a member of a chimpanzee group if you hold certain beliefs. So this is actually also a way in which humans are uniquely irrational. And we actually have a recent study. So this is a study run by one of my former graduate students, Josh Confer, who looked at this tendency of groupthink in very young children, so in 4-year-old children. And what Josh found was that when these children are not a member of a group, they reason very rationally about evidence, just like the chimps in our study. But once the children are members of a group and they know what their group thinks, they start to reason about the evidence in a much less rational way. They reason about the evidence in such a way that they actually arrive at the same beliefs as their group holds.
Jan, you talk about, human beings being very rational, but how do you explain people who think, like the earth is flat or the earth is hollow or things like that? How do you explain that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it's a question that I'm also very interested in from a scientific perspective, and we're doing research on this at the moment. So, and you're right. So far in this, I've mostly depicted humans as a very rational species, and I think we are very rational. But there are also certain irrational biases that influence our beliefs, that influence the beliefs we end up holding. So evidence is not really the only consideration that is important to the beliefs we end up holding. The fact that we rely on our group, the fact that we want to be accepted by our group is also very important to the beliefs we end up holding. So these are often called instrumental pressures on belief formation, as opposed to, evidentialist pressures on beliefs. So evidence can inform the beliefs we hold or can influence the beliefs we hold, but also these instrumental pressures, like what would be good for me to believe, can also end up influencing what we believe. So, the flat Earth example, probably most people who believe the Earth is flat are surrounded by many other people who believe the Earth is flat. And they feel that they're a member of a certain group and that they can only be a member of this group if they actually hold this belief. And yeah, I think you're completely right. This is actually one way in which humans are uniquely irrational relative to chimpanzees. So chimpanzees don't form these group-based beliefs. So in that sense, chimpanzees are actually more rational than humans.
Jan Engelmann, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark, for having me. It was really great talking to you. And thanks also, for spotlighting evolutionary psychology here a little bit. I've seen that most of your, previous sessions were about evolutionary biology, for example. And yeah, I think it's important to also recognize that the mind and our psychological capacities have evolved by natural selection.